Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to take a look at the collected info class that we created in an earlier video. And what we're going to do here is we're going to change the behavior a little bit of our fundamentals demo to leverage an instance of an object of a class. And specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to try to answer the question, who has the responsibility of formatting the data associated with an instance of an object? Put another way, if you recall from our previous example, we had created a DisplayInfo function that would present all of the information associated with an instance of the collected info known as sample collected info. Now, you're probably wondering why this is bad. Well, as we mentioned in an earlier video, if we added a field to our collected info, we would have to remember to go in and change it in the function DisplayInfo. And that's not that bad, except for the fact that it separates the class with the function that displays the information associated with the class. So looking at it from the other side of the coin, you can ask the question, who or what knows best about the collected info object? Well, the answer is that more than likely, the class does. And so the idea is that we want to create a function associated with an instance of the class that can ultimately sort of present the information in the way we want the collected info to be presented, instead of relying on some external function to do so. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to create a function inside of our collected info class. And we'll start off by making it public. That means it can be accessed from anywhere in our code, public. And then we will specify that the return type will be java.lang.string. And we're going to call this function toString, and it will accept no input arguments. And ultimately, what this is going to do is going to return a nicely formatted string with essentially whatever behavior or formatting we would like. And so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a local variable inside of this toString. It'll be of type java.lang.string. And again, I'm using the full names here so that we get familiar with where they are in the framework. And to keep a theme that I've used in my other videos, I'm simply going to call it results. You can call it whatever you'd like to, or whatever else makes sense to you. But in this case, I just like to use results. It's one less thing I have to worry about. And then I'm going to return my results. Now, you'll notice here that I went ahead and initialized the value to a set of empty quotes. And this means that it's a valid string, but it doesn't contain any characters. And so it's a 0-length string. What we're going to do is very carefully build how we want to present our collected info by simply adding to the initial value of results. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that there is technically another way of going about doing it, but we're going to keep this simple right now. There will be a little bit of performance penalty associated with it, but other than that, this is a perfectly acceptable way of doing it, and you're actually going to find yourself doing this in other languages as well. And so to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to say results plus equals, which allows for us to add back to the original results. We're going to preface it with our first name, colon, and you're probably wondering, where in the world did I get that from? Well, I'm simply following the format that we had used earlier in the earlier videos, and we will add now to this the value associated with this dot first name. Now, quickly, you can see why it is important that we assign default values in our constructor to each one of the fields, because otherwise you could accidentally be referencing a null value here. The other thing that we want to do is we want to append a new line onto the end of this. If we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves in a rather comical situation where all of our data is on a single line and it's going to be impossible to read. And so in this case, you'll notice that I'm using the single quotes followed or enclosing rather the new line character. And there's a couple of different ways that you can go about doing this as well. And you simply continue to add on here. There's our last name. This dot last name. And again, you add on to the end the new line. And at this point, you can probably guess that a little bit of copying and pasting might be beneficial. Or if you are good at typing, perhaps you can just do all of these individually, but we'll have the Blazor ID. Our initials. And so on. And so what we'll do is we'll go through and we will complete all of the rest of the fields. There's our last name, first name, last name, Blazor ID, initials, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And again, this just takes a little bit of time. Languages, goals for the class. And again, I'm just using that format that I had provided earlier in the text file. We have goals, professional, what your supposed graduation is, computer model, computer CPU, computer memory, and so on. And then you just want to make sure that you line up each one of the field names with their corresponding field name, or each one of the field values rather with the field name. And again, this just takes a little bit of effort. Almost there. And again, the significant advantage is that this toString function, of course, can be selective, meaning that you don't necessarily have to include all of the fields if you don't want to. But more importantly is as you add a field, you can quickly scroll down and then add, if you so choose, the field to be printed out to the console, or in this case, set to a string. We'll handle printing it to the console in just a second. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to then return the results of this concatenated string via the results variable to whichever function calls our toString. Now, let's see this in action. So what we'll do is we're actually going to go back to our FundamentalsDemo.java. And what we're going to do is we're going to leverage our DisplayInfo. And this time around, what we're going to do is we're going to do it ever so slightly different. And we'll actually call this DisplayInfo with toString. We'll say else if and args.length. Still, we're going to capture all 12 from the command line. And our args square bracket 0 equals ignore case, and then we're going to call this display info with toString. And if that's equal to true, then what we're going to do is we're going to pass the args to a constructor, or rather to the instance of the object. And then we're going to call the toString method associated with that instance. And so the first step is going to be to declare and initialize a new instance of our collected info. And to begin with, what we'll do is we'll do much like we did in the earlier example. So it's going to be EE333.collectedInfo. We'll keep the same variable name, sample collected info, and we'll say equal to new E333.collectedInfo, and it's a parameterless constructor. In other words, it accepts no input arguments. And now what we're going to do is very carefully take each one of the arguments and plug them into the corresponding field. Once again, we're not doing perfect object-oriented programming, and we need to do some additional validation. So note here, need to do additional validation. And there's all sorts of things we're overlooking for this example, but importantly, what we're going to do is we're going to say sample collected info dot first name is going to be equal to args square brackets 1, sample collected info dot last name is equal to args square brackets 2, and so on all the way through until the last field or our argument square bracket 11. Now you're probably wondering, why did I know to start off with args square bracket 1? Well, that's because our args square bracket 0 contains our switch, and the first piece of useful information is going to be in position 1 in our argument array. And so just continuing on with this, it's going to be the Blazor ID, args square brackets 3. And we want to check to make sure that we're keeping consistent with our file, and we are. Sample collected info dot initials will be our args square bracket 4, and so on. We said our languages were next. And once again, you can sort of see why capturing this information from the command line is going to be a little tedious and would probably be something that you would want to automate ultimately rather than do this manually, because capturing this many arguments from the command line can lead to a mistake. And so we have our professional goals, our square bracket 7. And this is really at probably the limit of what you would want to do from a command line perspective. And lastly, we have our CPU, which is going to be args square bracket 9, and our sample collected info dot computer memory is going to be args square brackets 10. I believe, let's make sure that we did not, in fact, miss one. If you're following along, you probably already found my error. First name, last name, Blazor ID initials, languages, goals for the class, goals professional. Ah, yes. We have not specified our graduation. And so a little bit of a tweak here. This becomes our args square brackets 8, 9, 10, and 11. Okay, now this doesn't look terribly different from what we've done before, in that we're still dealing with 11 different arguments. So building up your object might still be a little bit difficult. But what we want to do now is we want to focus on how our toString method in the instance of our collected info can actually help us, and will turn what was otherwise a very complicated or maybe slightly painful task of multiple print lines into a single print line. And to do this, we simply specify system.out.println. And what we're going to do now is we're going to print out our sample collected info dot toString. And so you can see here that what we're doing here is we're specifying now the toString method associated with the instance of the object. Now, one of the things that we want to do real quick is that should be a lowercase to. And if anything, what we want to do is we want to add the override. I was wondering where that was. I was expecting NetBeans to sort of chide me a little bit for not having the override in there. It was just because I accidentally hit the capital TO. It would have still worked, but what this does is it overrides the default toString. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That gets into inheritance and other topics associated with object-oriented design. At this point, though, all we need to do is go ahead and build this. And to speed this up just a little bit, I encourage you to go back to the example where we actually passed all of the arguments, and that was one of our original get infos. Instead, what we want to do is we want to call this one display info, or rather call it with the display info, and we specify display info with toString. Again, not the greatest switch name, but the idea is that we sort of want to document what we were doing here. So this is display info with toString. And assuming that we don't have any typos, you can see that we are successfully passing all 12 of our arguments. And we seem to have a little bit of a problem here that we haven't captured our first name, and that was just simply because in the example that I just picked, I had cleared that out from an earlier video. So again, let me just put my first name in there, and now we have all of the fields populated. And hopefully you can see the advantage of doing it this way. If we wanted to add a field to our class, which ultimately would come through then when we declared an instance of the class as an object, then you can leverage the toString, and you only have one line of code for the print. Likewise, when we get around to writing to a file, you'll have a single line to write the contents of an object to a file. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.